Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode and Downey. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hi, Federico.
Hey, John, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing all right. I'm recovering from, last week's big Mojave update and the review. That was a lot of fun, and I think people seemed to enjoy the review, which was nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had to kind of collapse for a couple of days after that and just take it easy.
How are you feeling about being done with the review and sort of having our big releases of the year behind us for now?
Yeah, I feel good about it. I mean, I really enjoy this time of year because I think it's just a lot of fun with the club thing going on and all the reviews and everybody kind of working together and getting a lot more content out than we typically would do in a given week or two. But I also feel like it's the reset button, right? This is like, in a way, this is the beginning of the year for us because we've gotten to a finish line of sorts, and now we can start thinking about what's next. And I'm hoping that that'll be some sort of iPad event this fall. We'll see, though.
Yeah, I really hope so because I really want to get a new iPad.
Yeah, I do too. I don't know if I mentioned it on this show, but I crunched it this summer, and I've been working on a 9 point. Actually, I've been working mainly on my Mac because the 9.7-inch iPad that they introduced in March is pretty good for writing if you just do a single window, a single app at a time. It's just not big enough, though, to really do a lot of side-by-side work.
Yeah, I just want a new iPad because the Apple Care replacement limit is up on mine, which I managed to break my iPad Pro twice in 2 years. So my Apple Care Plus is over. I get no more replacements for free. And if I break this iPad, it's gonna be €500. So
yeah, that's why I didn't replace mine because I think it was $650, and
Ooh.
I think within a span of about 4 weeks, you and I and Mike Hurley all broke our iPads.
If that's not a sign, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Apple, please hurry up and give us new iPads. What are we talking about today, John?
So today we are going to talk about Project Sneak Peek. At least that's what I like to call it. I know it was called Marzipan when it was just a rumor, but then, last WWC in June, Craig Federighi got up on stage and he said, you know what, we're going to come up with a way to bring your iOS apps to the Mac. And the whole thing was very short on details, but they said as phase one, we are bringing home, news, stocks, and voice memos all to the Mac, which previously were just exclusively iOS apps and in some cases just iPhone apps, but they're all on the iPad now too.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, this was the rumor leading up to WWDC. At some point, I think there was some confusion as to whether Project Marzipan, as a bunch of people were calling it, was going to be announced at WWDC or postponed to next year. And I guess the answer was something in the middle, that Apple teased this new project, this new effort, but clearly presented it as a multi-year type of initiative within Apple. That is, the 4 apps that we have in Mojave are only just a preview, just a test of bigger things to come. And funnily enough, a bunch of Apple engineers that I talked to in private conversations didn't use the Marzipan name. They just call it iPad apps on the Mac, which I think is interesting because if you look at them, they are actually iPad apps on the Mac,
right?
More than iPhone apps on the Mac. They're more like they use the iPad layout and many other details that they share with the iPad. So I kind of want to get into this discussion of, I want to go over some of the basic aspects of what is going on with these apps on the iPad and on the Mac in iOS 12. And then maybe we can talk about the sort of what it means to have these 4 apps on the Mac right now, what they're like right now, and also the bigger topic of what this means going forward for the future of the Mac and the future of software development on the Mac. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds very good. Yeah,
right.
What's interesting to me here is that these 4 apps I view them as kind of proof of concept and initial ports because what this project is supposed to do, just so from what little we do know, is it's supposed to make it, the way it makes it easier to bring an iOS app over to the Mac is by making it so that developers don't have to redo the entire UI and AppKit. Because right now, the UI elements that are in a Mac app and an iOS app are not the same, and they're different. And if you have an iOS app and you want to bring it over to the Mac, you really have to kind of write that interface part all over from scratch for the most part. And so what this does is it brings a lot of the underpinnings of iOS over to the Mac and makes them so that they work with things that are unique to the Mac. Things like having a pointer and having resizable windows and that sort of thing. Now, when you look at these 4 apps, if you're a Mac user and you use these apps, you notice right away that something's wrong, that these are not really Mac apps, at least not yet. And there's been, I think, a lot of people very unhappy with these 4 apps because they don't work as they expect. And there's like a million little things you can point to in each one of them. And maybe if you want, we can get into a little bit of that. But I think that's kind of missing the point, because I really do feel like these are proof of concept ports that, while they're not being called beta software, they kind of are beta software, because I think we've got a long way to go and that we're really only in the infancy of something that probably has a much bigger end goal than what we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a quick comment about the similarities between these apps and the iPad before I also have another comment to share that is sort of a jumping point for a bigger discussion. So I find it interesting that in order to bring these 4 apps to the Mac, with the exception of Home, Apple basically redesigned them all. So voice memos, stocks, and news, in order to come to the Mac, they also needed to gain a new design on iOS 12. And so these apps, in addition to the fact that voice memos and stocks came to the iPad the first time with the latest software update with iOS 12, news was also redesigned. And so it feels to me, the fact that all these apps are based on a sidebar type of layout on the iPad. So they have a sidebar on the left and they have content on the right. And Home is the only exception in that it uses the same design with the tiles and the expandable accessory widgets that launched in iOS 10, I think. It's interesting to me that Apple felt that it was necessary to bring these apps to the iPad if they also wanted to bring them to the Mac. Seems to me that there's a sort of an intention to share a common platform between the iPad and the Mac, because it's not like Apple could have brought voice memos as a type of small iPhone style utility and sort of stick it in a small window and adapt the iPhone version to the Mac. And that would have been one approach. The different approach that they chose is to make voice memos a full-blown iPad app with the UI that sort of is reminiscent of reminders, with a sidebar on the left side, content on the right side, and this kind of translucent layout. And then they also brought it to the Mac. So I do wonder if maybe going forward there will be an even stronger relationship between the work that Apple does on the iPad and the work that Apple does on the Mac. And I won't be surprised if we start seeing redesigns of built-in Apple apps that happen in simultaneously on iOS and the Mac, because that's the only way to advance this project is to have a common foundation, and a common foundation means everybody gets the new version at the same time. So if Apple is changing the iOS version, they're also going to change the Mac version.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. With Linode, you'll have access to a suite of powerful hosting options with prices starting at just $5 a month, and you'll be up and running with your own virtual server in the Linode cloud in under a minute. Linode features industry-leading performance with native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They now have over 10 data centers spread across the world, meaning you can serve your customers even quicker than before. Linode also has an API that allows you to easily automate tasks or develop custom applications in the cloud. And everything is manageable via the command line. All of Linode's pricing tiers feature hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans and add-on services like backups and node balancers. So what can you use Linode for? The answer is a whole lot of things. Hosting large databases, running a mail server, operating a VPN, running Docker containers, hosting a private Git server. The list just keeps going on and on. Also, Linode is hiring right now. If you're interested in that, go to linode.com/careers to learn more. Okay, so Linode also has fantastic pricing available. Their plans start at 16 gigabytes of RAM for just $5 a month, and they offer high memory plans starting with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And listeners of this show, if you sign up at linode.com/appstories, you'll not only be supporting the show, but you'll be getting $20 towards any Linode plan. That's a great deal. On the 1 gigabyte of RAM plan, that's like getting 4 free months. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, there's nothing to lose. So go to linode.com/appstories right away to learn more, sign up, and take advantage of the $20 credit. Or use the promo code AppStories2018 at checkout. Thanks again to Linode for supporting the show.
This sort of brings me to the second comment. For all the people that are complaining about the fact that these apps are not, they don't feel like Mac apps. Just as I was talking to you a couple of minutes ago, I clicked on the home icon on my Mac and I changed the lights in the bedroom, where I'm recording this podcast, to a different color. And I also dimmed them. I couldn't have done that, last year on the Mac because there was no home app. So what's best? Not to have a HomeKit on the Mac at all, or to at least have a working solution right now, which is not the best solution. It's not home on the Mac, definitely not a masterpiece in terms of Mac design. It's an iPad version adapted to the Mac, but at least it works.
Yeah.
And it's better than not having HomeKit at all.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that, because one of the things, when I was doing the Mojave review, I spent all my time in Mojave, and I was using those apps a lot because they're part of the review. And a lot of the oddities between Mac type software and iOS software, I call them out in the review. But I did find Home to be useful for the same exact reason, because I was sitting there working and my hands were on the keyboard on my Mac. And if I wanted to change the lights, it was super easy just to do it right there. Same goes for news. If I wanted to take a break and see what was going on in the world, I could just flip over to news. I mean, it is. I think it's a good thing to have these coming. And I think the other thing that you mentioned in kind of bringing some of the foundations of the iPad and the Mac together, I think some of the stuff we're seeing on the Mac with tabbing is the kind of thing I expect is going to come back to the iPad, because I feel like a tabbed interface is a better interface on the iPad than windowing. And I think that's where we're going to head with the iPad Pro. At least I hope it's where we're going to head. And that's something that Apple's been slowly revising the last couple of iterations of macOS. And it's, you can do a thing where you can show all tabs now. It just very much like zooms out into a grid of your tabs. Reminds me an awful lot of what you can do with an iPad in zooming out to do the multitasking.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something that Mark Gurman at Bloomberg reported, I think, months ago. The fact that Apple is considering for iOS 13 to next year in 2019 to improve iPad multitasking with with tabbing, basically to bring tabs or like in-app split view, which is currently exclusive to Safari, to all apps on the iPad. So I think we're going to see more and more as Apple moves forward with with the second phase of this project, a sort of a two-way exchange of technologies and design principles and ideas between the Mac and the iPad. I think we're going to see some iPad design principles and iPad interactions find their way to the Mac, and we're going to see some previously Mac-only features become available on the iPad. So the idea of, instead of saying we need to bring more iOS apps to the Mac, so let's do just that, whether it's an iPhone version or an iPad version, we'll just bring them over without changing anything. And instead of just saying we want to make the iPad more like the Mac, I think Apple wants to sort of strike a balance somewhere in the middle, where the end goal, and I strongly believe this will be their end goal, is to have one. I don't know if it's one single OS, like just one operating system. I think eventually that's sort of my personal belief, is that that's what Apple wants to do eventually, like 10 years from now. But in the short term, I strongly feel that one shared app platform where developers don't have to worry about, I need to make this app in UIKit for iOS, and then I also need to make a version in AppKit for macOS, but to have one app, one platform where the same app can scale to multiple screen sizes and to different devices and to different input methods. I think that's, that will be, for consumers and for users, that will be a much better scenario than when we are right now. Because again, longtime Mac users may complain about the fact that this title bar that features the name of the app is not native to the Mac. And I don't argue with that. Like, if you know classic, if you know traditional Mac design, if you read the human interface guidelines multiple times, you will see instantly that these 4 apps on Mojave are not great examples of Mac design. But for people who don't care about these problems, these 4 apps solve issues that people had for a long time. Like, why shouldn't I be able to record a quick voice memo on the Mac instead of having to use QuickTime? Why shouldn't I be able to change the color of my lights while I'm sitting at my iMac? It doesn't make any sense. So there's always a tension, I think, between what the true sort of passionate Mac users think it's best for the Mac and what regular people actually want from a computer. And I think Apple is very much in the camp of serving the best interest of people who actually go to the Apple Store and buy a Mac and don't read Mac stories or Daring Fireball or 9to5Mac. Like, actual people who just want a good computer and they trust Apple to make a good computer with a solid operating system. And then they fire up their computer and they notice the Home app and the Voice Memos app that they use on the iPhone is not on the Mac. So I don't think Apple wants to necessarily serve us, and by us I mean we, the people who criticize every single design detail of Apple software, but they want to serve consumers, and consumers they just wanna, they just want the classic Apple integrated experience.
Right.
They don't care about breaking the interface guidelines, or they don't care about this design minutiae that we may notice.
Yeah, it makes a big difference for someone to be able to turn on their Mac and see an environment that's familiar. And the fact of the matter is that iOS is the more familiar environment now, because there are far more users of iOS devices than there are of Macs. Thanks to Downy for supporting App Stories this week. Downy is a great Mac utility for downloading videos from the web. The brilliant part about it is just how many different sites that it works with. There are lots of video download utilities out there that work with YouTube, Vimeo, and maybe a handful of others, but Downy works with over 1,100 different sites. That's over 1,000 sites. You'll be hard-pressed to find another app that can handle that many different sites. There's a browser extension too, so you're always just one click away while you're using Safari to downloading the video that you see. Downy is also constantly being improved, so it's always up to date and getting new site support. There's even a support button right in the app, so if you run into some kind of trouble or don't know how to do something, you're just a few clicks away from getting the help that you need. There's also support for all kinds of advanced features, like downloading subtitles, pulling just the audio track out of a video, 4K video support for YouTube, and a whole lot more. Pulling audio tracks off is something that I like to do a lot, because what I'll do is I will find a conference where there's a speaker who I really want to listen to, and I just don't have time to sit in front of my screen and watch the video. So I'll just pull the audio and use it just like I would a podcast, listening to it when I'm out and about, listening on my iPhone. I also like to collect music videos. There's all sorts of little things that you come across on YouTube and other video sites that you want to keep. Maybe it's a bit of history, maybe it's a music video like I do, or whatever it is. But the thing about Downy is you can get those and download them very, very quickly and get them organized and saved for later. Check out Downy today at software.charliemonroe.net/Downy, where you'll learn all the details about the app and start building a library of your own favorite video files today. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Thanks again to Downy for supporting the show. There are a couple of things I guess we should talk about even more. Is one, I think your point about meeting in the middle is important, because I think a lot of the criticism I've read works on the underlying presumption that iOS is coming to take over the Mac, and that the Mac is becoming iOS, which I don't really think is true. The way I see what's happening here is, I think what's going to happen is that they're going to meet in the middle somehow. And the contours of what that exactly means are obviously very unclear right now. And one of the problems we have is that these 4 apps that we have as examples, these are really simple apps. These are not like GarageBand or Logic or, Pages or Numbers or anything like that. These, for the most part, even on iOS, you would consider these very simple apps, because they're really just, for the most part, single view apps with very few controls. And with the exception of being able to record a voice memo, these are not creation apps. These are not users aren't creating documents or songs or design work or whatever it is. These are just apps where you go and you click around a little bit to read an article or see how your stocks are doing, or maybe turn the lights on and off. So, we've got a long way to go before we get to those apps where it's going to be very interesting to see how where do numbers and pages, which are quite fairly similar on both platforms, but still quite different, how do those meet in the middle? And where do things go with apps like Logic or Final Cut Pro? Because those are much more complex apps than anything that we've seen so far. But I do think it's a matter of meeting in the middle, both from a design standpoint. And I think one of the apps that's really interesting to look at right now that not too many people are talking about is the Mac App Store. Because the new Mac App Store, there is no Mac App Store on iOS. That is a Mac app. But it looks a lot more like these 4 apps that they brought over from iOS. And it seems to me that might be a bit of a tell in terms of where Apple sees design going on these apps going forward.
That's an interesting point. I do think we're going to see these, and it probably will not be like a single major event, but over time, I think we're going to see this sort of new design language that Apple is developing, both on iOS and macOS. And I think we all will notice, increasingly notice similarities between the two. And the idea of meeting somewhere in the middle, it's why I don't like to take such a sort of extremist position on this problem. Because I do believe that ultimately it comes down to serving people. And it's funny that, and I struggle to put this sort of to put this concept in words for a long time, but I think it's funny that in our community, on Twitter and on other blogs, we often see the idea that Apple in recent years they've sort of spread themselves too thin, and they're working on too many things at once, and they don't put the same amount of care into individual projects as they once did. And so I find it funny that idea can also coexist with the criticism of Marzipan and say, no, we don't want these iOS apps on the Mac. We want Apple to also make full alternative versions of all the apps that Apple is making for iOS. So the same people that are saying Apple is working on too many projects, they also want Apple to not to save time and effort and resources by making a shared app platform, but they want them to continue working on 2 totally separate and independent app platforms. Like, something's gotta give if you want Apple to keep making both iOS and the Mac. And I feel like arguing for keeping the Mac as as independent from iOS, as separate as possible from iOS, is actually going to doom the Mac eventually, because I feel like it's and recent years, like if you look at the history of the Mac, like since the debut of the Mac App Store, the facts are speaking for themselves. Like, it's obvious that Apple hasn't given the same attention to the Mac as they've given to iOS. And so if we truly believe that the Mac as a computing, as a form factor, like the idea of sitting down at a desk with a large display, with a powerful computer that allows, artists to work on 3D graphics or movies or music, if that idea needs to exist, and I strongly believe that the Mac needs to exist, it's best for consumers, it's best for pro users, it's best for Apple it's best for everybody, even for developers. If the company who makes the Mac can find a way to make the Mac more relevant, more easily and more quickly, instead of having to do these announcements every 4 to 5 years. No, we really care about the Mac.
Right.
It's better. Sometimes you just need to maybe accept the fact that the iOS app platform has become more vibrant and more popular than stuff on the Mac, like especially for consumer apps.
Yeah, well, right. That's exactly the point that I was going to make. And it's interesting to me that the first 4 apps that we see on the Mac coming over from iOS are very much consumer-friendly apps, because I think that's where the Mac has probably suffered the most in recent years. But by the same token, I think that we're going to start seeing some of those pro apps. I mean, this is a way for potentially the pro apps on the Mac to migrate into something like the iPad Pro too. If you have a common platform that scales well all the way from a tablet or an iPhone all the way up to an iMac Pro or a Mac Pro, if we ever see it, then you've got something that will work for every user, from the simplest user to the professional user. But the difficulty is going to be in the execution, obviously, and that's the thing that's hard right now, is that we see, I think, so little of what this is ultimately going to be by looking at these 4 apps, that it's an exciting time. I think I'm very interested to see how it all shakes out. But I think to prejudge it based on these 4 apps is wrong, because we've got a long way to go on this. And I do think when you say, maybe there's a unification 10 years down the road, it probably is that far off. I mean, there's going to be a lot of kind of uncomfortable transitions in the interim, and we're going to have some people who don't like them because they liked it the way it was, and change is always difficult in any aspect of life, but it's going to be uncomfortable at times on the Mac, I think.
Yeah. And I understand why there's a bit of frustration with the idea of the Mac is getting the leftovers from iOS, like that kind of mindset that they're paying attention to the Mac just because they can bring over their iPad stuff. But I don't think Apple sees it this way. Like right now, yes, it looks like Apple just took 4 iPad apps and brought them over to the Mac. But I think the end goal is to make sure that everybody, no matter the computer they prefer, no matter the OS they like most, can get access to the same Apple software everywhere and the same experience everywhere. And I think what's going to be tricky for Apple is to make sure that the integration between software and hardware, this idea that they pride themselves upon every single time they can talk about it, to make sure that software can stay true to the hardware it runs on, even though it's a shared platform. So that's going to be tricky. Like how do you cater to different types of interactions, with the cursor and with desktop controls, with the same technology that also needs to power multi-touch and different types of touch interactions like that. From a technical standpoint, I think it's going to be tricky, but I strongly believe that if there's a company that can solve this problem conceptually and technically, it's going to be Apple. Because I mean, even if you look at the work that Apple has done in interface design for the past couple of years, if you look at the iPhone 10 and what they've been able to accomplish in terms of rethinking the entire gestural engine, I think that is just remarkable. And so I don't have any doubt on the fact that Apple can provide an elegant solution to this. But also at the same time, I think there's going to be challenges.
Right.
Also, in terms of like, if you want to have more, if you have to have some kind of unity and more consistency between platforms, one right now is more advanced than the other. So if you look at the Mac and you look at the iPad does not have, iPad apps lack any kind of knowledge of things such as connecting to an external display or dealing with files coming from external storage, or the notion of having multiple users using the same app, and how do you communicate that. So all these features that are native to the Mac and have been available on the Mac for such a long time, they need to become commonplace on the iPad as well. Not to mention, like, if you want to have an app that runs on a large display, it also means you probably should avoid just making an iPhone app and making it bigger, which means more iPad apps need to take advantage of the screen in a better way. So whether it's a sidebar or multiple windows, it needs to be more than just an iPhone version blown up to fill the screen. And again, keyboard shortcuts, another example of where the Mac is arguably more advanced than iOS, is wider support for keyboard shortcuts and customization of the UI, toolbars, stuff like that. It's going to be a long road. And from this perspective, I don't think it's surprising that Apple framed it as phase one, because there's going to be a lot of work for Apple to ship a good and native solution that feels right to use.
Yeah, there really is going to be a long road. And I kind of feel like this is, in a way, I feel like that we've seen this more than once with the iPhone, in that the early iPad, despite kind of marketing it as something different than the iPhone, Apple really did treat it like a blown up iPhone for a really long time, because the iPhone was super successful. But it's only now starting to do things like you said with news, pulling things out to a sidebar, and has the multitasking, doing things that are unique to the iPad and that play to the iPad's strengths and the bigger screen, that lend themselves now, if they start getting things like access to external storage and displays and all that sort of thing, can start evolving the iPad to give it some of the more powerful features that you find on the Mac already. All right, Federico. Well, you know what? I think that we're going to have a lot more to talk about this on this subject over the coming months and even years at this point, don't you think?
Yeah, I think we barely scratched the surface. Based on what we know right now, I think there's going to be a lot more to discuss.
Yeah.
Next year, whether Apple opens up a framework for developers or if they bring even more iPad apps to the Mac, there's basically the entire media aspect of this. Music, podcasts, TV. That's, I strongly feel that we're going to see that on the Mac next. So I'm sure we will have plenty of material to cover for this topic.
Oh, and iOS 13. I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things that all feed into this theme. But it's good to kind of get some of the issues and ideas out in the open and start talking about them now, because it'll be interesting to see exactly how it all shakes out. All right. Well, thanks to our sponsors for this week's show, Linode and Downey, for making it possible. And as usual, everybody can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is also Vitici on Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.